let us try to understand the difference between William Wordsworth and Coleridge in context of romantic poetry. In the previous session, we have already understood the life and works of both these romantic poets who belong to first generation of romantic poetry. William Wordsworth is an innovative writer who marked the start of romantic period in literature, and he is also regarded as nature poet. For him, nature is healing entity which heals the mind and also a moral guide. With Samuel Taylor Coleridge, he jointly published lyrical ballads in the year 1798, and he was the poet laureate of England from 1843 to 1850. Some of his very famous poems are Daffodils, which is also known as I Wandered Lonely as a Cloud, Solitary Reaper, Tintern, The World is Too Much with Us, are some of the best poems or lyrics contributed by William Wordsworth. In all these poems, we can easily trace his concept of poetry and worship of nature. Next is Samuel Taylor Coleridge. Though he was a friend of William Wordsworth and they together contributed lyrical ballads in literature, he was not just a poet, he was also known as critic and philosopher. Coleridge is co-founder of Romantic Revival in the late 18th century. Though he was friend, confidant and consultant to William Wordsworth, he was also a close friend of Charles Lamb, William Hazlitt, Thomas de Quincey and other romantic prose writers. Coleridge wrote much more than just the Rime of Ancient Mariner. His contribution to romantic poetry is less. He wrote very few poems. Some of the examples are like Kubla Khan, Christabel, and a Ode to Dejection. These are very few poems. Why? Because later he developed interest in criticism and philosophical issues. It may be on slavery, education, religion, and other current affairs during that time. Coleridge is one of the first critics to give close critical attention to language, the form of poetry, and according to him, it is through the medium of beauty the poetry can give pleasure and also it should have some philosophical insight. So we can say that Coleridge is also a critic whose ideas are later developed by other critics in new criticism. William Wordsworth and Coleridge are together published lyrical ballads and they revolted against new classical age. They are companions, writers, but still, though they are contemporary, they have some difference of opinion. It may be on the subject of poetry or the form of poetry and also the definition. The Wordsworth's definition of poetry is very oft quoted. According to him, poetry is spontaneous overflow of powerful feelings recollected in tranquility. And in the second edition of Lyrical Ballads, William Wordsworth says that poetry it should be simple and every ordinary person should have the understanding of poetry. He is a man speaking to men. According to him, poet is a person who can connect to the ordinary people through his words or poem. A man, it is true, endued with more lively sensibility, more enthusiasm and tenderness, who has a great knowledge of human nature. In the poems of Wordsworth, we find the same ideology. He is a poet whose poems, when we read, we find that he is directly communicating with us, and he speaks also of nature and the relationship between man and nature. He is more comprehensive soul than are supposed to be common among mankind. A poet should have comprehensive soul according to Wordsworth. But Coleridge, he says that a great poet, without being at the same time a profound philosopher, means a poet should also be a philosopher. He must be a great poet only when he has a profound knowledge of philosophy. A poet must also be a philosopher. He must be an educated person. Being a poet doesn't mean that he always wander or write on his fancy or imagination. He must be an educated person. He should have worldly knowledge and possess poetic genius at the same time. So this is the concept of poet according to Coleridge. Yes, the definition of poetry. Wordsworth defined poetry as spontaneous overflow of powerful feelings and emotions recollected in tranquility. He gave importance to spontaneity, expressing feelings in a spontaneous way. But Coleridge says that he defined poetry as a composition which is opposed to works of science by its subject. So poetry, what we have to call poetry? It should be mainly totally opposite to science. Science is a subject where we discuss facts, where it is also considered as dry subject, whereas poetry involves pleasure and emotions. So that must be the aim of poetry. It must be completely opposite to the works of science by its subject. We cannot write poem on science matters. Best words in best order is another saying of Coleridge, means poetry, unlike Wordsworth, should not be written in a free way. He should not write accordingly. It must be in a best order. He gave importance to order or the structure of poetry. Next is subject matter. What must be the subject matter? A poet must write on what kind of subject in his poem. According to William Wordsworth, he can write poem on childhood memories, his own personal experience, or rustic, humble and common life. That is the difference between Romantic age and Neoclassical age. In Neoclassical age, poets wrote, they gave focus only on urban life or upper class people, elite, whereas Wordsworth wrote on rustic, humble and common people. He also wrote on beautiful landscapes, forms of nature. It may be river, it may be flower, or it may be a poem on singing of a solitary reaper. In the poems of Wordsworth, we find this kind of subject matter, which are considered earlier as silly topics. Whereas Coleridge wrote on supernatural, extraordinary, and mysterious elements that can be found in human nature. That is the difference between Wordsworth and Coleridge. Wordsworth made natural into supernatural, whereas Coleridge wrote supernatural things or elements which seemed very natural in his poem. For example, in a poem like A Rhyme on Ancient Mariner, it consists of full of supernatural elements, mystical elements, which are depicted natural. Nature is not only the subject matter. According to Coleridge, he talks about psychology of character. The language of poem. What kind of language the poet prefer? It must not be the high level or the standard language. Instead, Wordsworth in his preface says that the language of poetry must be simple, which can be easily understood by common men. He used the language and subjects of common man to convey his ideas against the Augustan age decorum and overflow. The language in the poems of Wordsworth is very simple to understand, but at the same time he talks about some deeper meaning of life in a simple language. And he was against using a standard level or high level language like Augustan writers. But Samuel Coleridge, he wrote poems with metrical arrangement, and they are sophisticated, ornamented, and elevated. And that is why he drifted away from Wordsworth. The object of writing poem, or the purpose according to Wordsworth, is to spread humanitarian values and attitude. At the end of poem, it must spread humanitarian values. Some values or moral changes must occur after reading poetry. That is the purpose of poem according to Wordsworth. But Coleridge says that poem should give pleasure, and this pleasure is from whole parts and from each part. So, according to Coleridge, the only purpose of poetry is to give pleasure. It must bring happiness amongst readers.